All right, buckle up because today we're going deep, really deep into a dark part of American history.
Ooh, this is gonna be good.
Yeah, we're talking about Stephen Morin, a suspected serial killer believed to be responsible for, get this, up to 48 deaths across the U.S.
48. Wow. Okay, you have my attention.
Oh, it gets even wilder. We're talking the 70s and early 80s here. And Morin was practically a ghost, always on the move, changing his name, making him incredibly difficult to track.
Like a phantom, huh? Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
Well, luckily, we've got a mountain of sources to help us untangle this twisted story. We're talking court records, old newspaper clippings, even some books that try to piece together Morin's chilling journey.
So, what's the mission for today's deep dive? What are we hoping to uncover?
We're going to try to understand who Stephen Morin was, what drove him to commit such horrific acts, and how he managed to evade capture for so long.
You know, it's interesting you use the word evade because this constant movement, this transient nature, as some call it, might actually be a key part of understanding Morin's crimes. It often suggests a deep instability, a lack of real connection, which, is often seen in serial killers.
So, like he was running from something. Even himself, maybe.
Exactly. And get this, we don't actually know a lot about Morin's early life, but we do know he was born in Rhode Island in 1951.
Rhode Island, okay.
Yeah, and from what we can gather from the sources, he had a pretty troubled childhood. Seems like poverty played a big role.
Tough start.
Really tough. And he was already in trouble with the law as a teenager. Car theft, actually. Ended up in juvenile detention. It's a pattern you see sometimes with serial killers. Difficult upbringing, early run-ins with the law. It's like, well, it sets the stage.
Right, almost like those early experiences create this disconnect, like a disregard for the rules that everyone else follows.
Absolutely. And when you combine that with a personality that's always seeking escape, always trying to reinvent itself, it can be, well, a dangerous combination.
A recipe for disaster, really.
Exactly. After he's released, Morin starts drifting across the country, adopting different identities. He actually spends a good chunk of the 70s in Northern California, around the San Francisco Bay Area specifically.
Interesting.
Yeah, he's working odd jobs, living under the radar, but there's this undercurrent of danger there. And then in 1976, there's this horrific attack in San Francisco, and this is where we see a real shift in his behavior.
This is the case with the 14-year-old girl, right?
Yeah, he lures her to his apartment, restrains her, subjects her to, well, hours of brutal assault. The level of violence here is really a turning point. It suggests that his crimes are becoming more sadistic, more predatory.
It's like a switch flipped, right? Almost like he crossed a line he couldn't come back from.
It really does seem that way. And what's chilling is that from this point on, the trail of victims starts to spread across multiple states. He would appear in a town, commit a heinous crime, and then vanish before anyone could catch him.
He really was a ghost. So how on earth did anyone even begin to connect the dots? I mean, back then, communication between police departments wasn't what it is today, was it?
No, not at all. And Morin absolutely exploited those limitations. That's what makes this case so fascinating and, well, terrifying. I mean, try to imagine trying to solve a puzzle when the pieces are scattered across the entire country.
Talk about a challenge.
A huge challenge. But, within this broader pattern of Morin's movements, there are these truly disturbing details. Specific things he did that give us a glimpse into, well, the dark corners of his mind.
Okay, let's get into some of those cases. I know you've got some details that'll definitely stick with us.
Let's start with Sheila Griffith in 1979. She disappears from Las Vegas, and months later, her body is found out in the Mojave Desert. Think about that for a second. He takes his victim across state lines, chooses a remote locations to get rid of the body. It suggests a level of planning, of premeditation that's, well, it's chilling and also makes it really difficult for investigators.
It's like he's trying to erase any trace of her, make her disappear completely.
Exactly. Then there's the case of Susan Belote in 1980. She vanished while shopping, just going about her day, and then suddenly gone. Her body was found months later, and this detail always stuck with me. They found a large stone placed on top of her body.
A stone. What was that about? Just to conceal the body, you think?
It's possible, but it could be something more, maybe a ritualistic element or a need to exert control even after death. These little details are what forensic psychologists would really focus on, trying to understand the killer's mindset.
Like a signature almost, a way of marking his crimes.
Yeah, you could see it that way. And it gets even more unsettling. That same year, Cheryl Daniel was abducted from a supermarket parking lot. Again, just an ordinary activity turned terrifying. Later found with a gunshot wound to the head. The brutality, the coldness, it's a stark reminder that, well, that evil exists in this world.
Listening to all this, it's hard not to think about the victims' families. The not knowing, the waiting. It must have been unbearable.
It must have been. And remember, these are just a few of the cases linked to Morin. Each one represents a life cut short, a family shattered by grief.
And all the while, he just kept moving, leaving a trail of pain across the country.
Right. In 1981, it continues with Sheila Whalen. She's found stabbed to death in a Colorado motel room. They linked Morin to the crime through some clothing they found in his van. And this is where forensic science starts to play a bigger role in the investigation.
So even though Morin was trying to stay ahead, technology was catching up.
Exactly. And it wasn't just physical evidence. They also had Pamela Jackson's testimony. She had been abducted by Morin earlier that year.
Right, she survived, incredibly.
She did. She survived 11 days of captivity, and her account of what she endured is just, well, harrowing. He forced her to dye her hair, threatened her constantly. It's remarkable that she escaped.
Her story must have been crucial for investigators to understand Morin's methods, his psychology.
Oh, absolutely. Jackson's testimony provided this first-hand look into the mind of a killer, confirmed the brutality, the manipulation, the way he planned his crimes.
But tragically, even as Pamela Jackson was escaping, Morin was already claiming another victim. Just days later, Jana Bruce was abducted from a hotel parking lot and found strangled. It's like this terrifying crescendo, each crime building on the last. And this leads us to his final acts in Texas.
And Texas is where the net finally starts to close in. The crimes there and the escalating violence, it's almost like he's daring the authorities to catch him.
Okay, so we're on the edge of Morin's capture here. But before we get there, I think it's important to remember that these aren't just statistics. We're talking about real people. Real lives tragically cut short.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get lost in the details of the case, but we have to remember the human cost. Behind every name, every date, there's a story of unimaginable pain.
And we're going to keep that in mind as we continue to explore this dark chapter. Next time, we'll pick up Morin's story in Texas and see how his reign of terror finally came to an end. So last time we left off with Stephen Morin on his way to Texas in 1981. What happened next?
Texas, well, that's where everything really starts to unravel. It's like all the pressure just gets to him, and he gets, well, more reckless, more desperate.
So walk us through those last few weeks. What were the crimes that finally brought him down?
Well, it all starts in early December '81. He shoots Michael Reed and Pearl Butts in San Antonio.
Oh, wow.
They both survived, thankfully. But then, not long after, there's this much more serious incident. The murders of Carrie Marie Scott and Drew Valdez, also in San Antonio.
And Drew Valdez survived that, right?
She did, miraculously, but Carrie Marie Scott, tragically, did not.
I can only imagine the pressure that put on law enforcement after those shootings, especially with Carrie Scott's death.
Absolutely. The police are closing in, and Morin, he knows it. And things, well, they get even crazier when Morin escapes police custody at the Sands Motel in San Antonio.
Wait, he escaped?
He did. He was holed up there with Sarah Clark. And get this, Pamela Jackson, who had been missing for 11 days at that point. Imagine that. The police storm the room, ready to arrest Morin, and he's just gone.
Wow, that's intense. So he gets away, but he still has two women with him. What happened to Sarah Clark?
That's a question that's been debated for years. Sarah Clark, she was Morin's traveling companion. Some say she was a willing accomplice. Others say she was a victim, manipulated and controlled by Morin.
Right, right.
The truth, like a lot of things in this case, is, well, murky. Adds another layer of complexity to this already twisted story.
It's a good reminder that even in a story as dark as this one, there are still those shades of gray. But back to Morin's escape. He's on the run again, but he wasn't free for long, was he?
No, the very next day, he carjacks Margaret Mayfield Palm, forces her at gunpoint to drive him to a bus station. But by then, the police were one step ahead. They had him surrounded. And finally, after months, maybe even years of terror, Stephen Morin was in custody.
I bet there was a collective sigh of relief in those communities that he had terrorized. Finally, it was over. But what about the victims' families? What happened next for them?
Well, Morin was convicted for the murders of Carrie Scott, Jana Bruce, and Cheryl Daniel, and he received the death penalty for those crimes.
Wow.
He was also extradited to Colorado, where he got another death sentence for the murder of Sheila Whalen. Now, they suspected him in many more murders, but those were the cases with the strongest evidence. And while convictions, they can never truly bring back a loved one, they do offer a sense of justice, a recognition of the terrible wrong that was done.
It's a small comfort, I suppose. But let's talk about Morin himself. He ends up on death row. What happens in those final years? Did he show any remorse? Did he try to explain his actions?
That's what makes this case so fascinating, and maybe even more disturbing. Morin, well, he goes through this big transformation on death row, converts to Christianity, expresses a desire for forgiveness.
A genuine change of heart? Or was it just a last-ditch effort to save himself?
Tough to say, really. He even withdrew his appeals, seemed like he was accepting his fate. But then there's this detail about his execution that adds another layer. The execution technicians, they struggled to find a vein for the lethal injection. Morin's years of drug abuse, they had taken their toll.
So his past was literally catching up to him.
Exactly. Some people saw it as a final act of defiance, his body resisting the punishment. Others saw it as just a consequence of his past, his body bearing the weight of a life full of addiction and violence.
It's haunting, for sure. What were his last words? Did he offer any insight into his mind, the mind of a killer?
His last meal was steak, baked potato, banana pudding. Yeah, pretty traditional. And his last words were, "Father, forgive these people, for they know not what they do. Forgive them as you have forgiven me, and I have forgiven them. Lord Jesus, I commit my soul to you."
A plea for forgiveness. For himself and for the people taking his life. It leaves us with so many questions. Did he really find redemption? Or was it all just an act?
Impossible to know for sure. Stephen Morin, he was like a phantom, drifting across the country, leaving a trail of pain and unanswered questions. Even in death, he remains an enigma.
And the impact of his crimes on the victims' families, on law enforcement, on our understanding of evil, it's something we're still wrestling with today.
Right. Cases like Morin's, they force us to confront the darkest parts of human nature. They make us ask, how can we prevent something like this from happening again? How can we understand the minds of people capable of such terrible things?
And those are questions we'll keep exploring right here on The Deep Dive. But let's shift gears a bit. I know you have some thoughts on what Morin's case reveals about how criminal investigations have changed, especially when dealing with a killer who is constantly on the move. It's wild to think how different things were back then, especially for law enforcement, trying to catch a killer like Morin who's always on the move.
Oh, for sure. It was a completely different world. Like, remember, we're talking the 70s, early 80s. They didn't have the same level of communication between agencies that we have today, or the same data sharing. Trying to track someone like Morin, crossing state lines, using all these fake names, leaving a trail of crimes that seemed totally unconnected, it must have been a nightmare.
Like, it's almost impossible to even imagine.
Yeah, it really was.
So what were some of the biggest obstacles investigators faced back then?
Well, one of the huge ones was just connecting the dots. Back then, they didn't have a good way to share information about crimes that happened in different places. You could have a murder in, like, California and a similar one in Texas, and no one would know they might be connected, even if it was the same person.
So it's like Morin was using that to his advantage, exploiting the system.
Exactly. And that's why cases like his and some other big serial killer cases from that time, they forced law enforcement to change how they did things, made them realize they needed better communication, shared databases, a more coordinated way to track criminals across state lines.
Right, so they had to up their game to stay ahead of the bad guys. And was that also a time when forensic science was making some big leaps forward?
Oh, totally. Think about DNA analysis. That wasn't even a thing back when Morin was active. Now it's like crucial, right? Linking crimes, identifying suspects, even proving someone innocent. But back then, investigators, well, they had to rely on fingerprints, ballistics, things like that. And of course, eyewitness accounts.
And Morin was so good at covering his tracks, it must have been incredibly frustrating for them.
You can bet it was, but even with all those limitations, you still had detectives, forensic people, criminal profilers, all these dedicated people who were trying new things, developing new techniques, finding ways to put the pieces together. And in a way, Morin's case, as awful as it was, it actually helped move things forward, helped accelerate those advances in forensics.
Wow. So even as he was running, he was unintentionally helping them create the tools that would eventually catch other criminals.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But, I want to shift gear a bit. We've talked a lot about the investigation, about how they tried to catch Morin. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the victims' families. The ripple effect of these crimes, it goes way beyond just the headlines.
Oh, absolutely. The pain for the families of Morin's victims, it never goes away. They buried their loved ones, they had to live with the trauma, and they were always left with that question, why? It's something they carry with them every single day.
And for the survivors, like Pamela Jackson, the scars, they must be so deep, both physically and emotionally.
It's true. Pamela Jackson's story, it's amazing, shows how strong the human spirit can be. But it's also a reminder that recovering from something like that, well, it's a long and hard road.
We have to remember this isn't just a story. These are real lives, changed forever by one man.
Absolutely. And that's why when we study these cases, when we try to understand someone like Stephen Morin, we can't ever forget the human cost.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground today, explored Stephen Morin's life, the crimes, the challenges of catching him, and the impact he had on so many people.
And hopefully for you listening, this deep dive has made you think. Maybe you're asking some questions about evil, about how the human mind works, about the struggle for justice.
And if you're interested in learning even more about Stephen Morin's case, there are some great books out there. We recommend Signs of a Serial Killer by Crystal Clary, The Eyes of a Stranger by Carrie Fredrickson and Sarah Story. Target of a Serial Killer by Sarah Leah Peason. They give you different perspectives on Morin's crimes and how they affected everyone around him.
We always say that the best deep dives leave you with more questions than answers, and this one definitely does that. It makes you wonder, can we ever really understand the kind of darkness that drives someone like Stephen Morin?
It's a chilling thought for sure, and I think it's one that'll stay with us long after this deep dive is over.